Welcome, everybody, and hi from Tallahassee, Florida. We are here to have our monthly webinar on our anti-trafficking information and activities and program issues, ideas, and support for you. This is a program that we do as part of the work. We are with the work we do here locally is with the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking, or BBCAT. We meet quarterly, and our next meeting will be in November. The date isn't set yet, but we are looking forward to that. There's the information for Kelly if you want to go back. Thanks. Kelly Doherty is our contact there, and we really encourage you, both if you are somebody in our area, to join us, or you can always be in touch with me at STAC, and I can give you a hand there. And if you are not in the Big Bend, to try to find your local coalition or your task force so you can be part, of this community effort. A little bit about STAC, the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. We were formed in 2015, and our mission is twofold. The first is to provide support and to walk with all survivors of trafficking, labor or sex trafficking survivors, people regardless of age, regardless of whether of their faith affiliation or any other sort of subcategory of a demographic. We help everyone, as well as people who are at risk, because sometimes it's really hard to tell if someone is or has been trafficked. So we are there for all in terms of this issue. We do case management, direct assistance, providing transportation. We help get people get in contact with our partners, like legal services or housing or counseling or other needs that someone has. Or we we provide direct aid, cash assistance, etc., through our partnership with the International Rescue Committee. We're doing especially a lot this year to reach to our rural areas, because people so mistakenly believe that human trafficking is only something that happens in our big cities. We know it happens in rural areas, and all the research supports that. So this is what we do: community education, like today, and I'll give you some more info about that with what we do. While we're located in the Big Bend and in Leon County, in our 6-county area that we serve, you will find that a lot of the stuff we have out here really can be used anywhere across the nation or internationally. Okay, next slide, please. Here's our website, surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. And I mention this now so that you know, after you have gone through today's presentation, and I hope you will find it as informative and important as I know it will be, that if you want to share it with anybody, this webinar and all of our Third Friday webinars and other programs are on this website under the tab that says information and educational resources. So you'll be able to see this again. If you're not catching it live or you have to leave early, you can watch it. And that'll be available. And of course, all of our work is free of charge, whether it is this kind of a training, as well as the services we provide to survivors. Okay, next slide, please. And we have a lot of stuff on our website. And just so you know, one of the latest things that we've done, and there's the QR code if you want to use your phone now to scan that. But we have a podcast. Our podcast is unique in a way in that it's kind of the only one I know of that is really focused only on survivors. One of our episodes dropped yesterday. This is by a gentleman, Samir Jain. He's a survivor of labor trafficking and is someone that STAC worked directly with years ago. This one is different. The first 3 episodes, also excellent, featured survivors of sex trafficking and their wisdom, really, in talking about what they know and what they've learned, and how this knowledge can really infuse and inform all of our work. So we've done a lot, and I encourage you all to do a lot as well, to work with survivors directly, to to hire as consultants, as program staff, to really make sure we're talking to the experts and being informed. So this podcast is one of the ways Stack does that. Okay, next slide, please. So we're almost upon this deadline, but it's not too late. Through a generous support of a donor, we are able to offer a first prize, second prize, and third prize for those who would like to create a mural that depicts really the themes from surviving to thriving, a call to end human trafficking. This is an idea, and I'd be delighted if anybody wants to copy it and do the same thing. But what we're doing is we've put out there that we'd like to have a call to artists to create a design for a mural that we're going to reproduce onto a large canvas, the size of a regular mural, or pretty big, that we're going to take from community to community in our 6-county area to really have public facing events about this issue, to do general information, to talk about the artwork and what it depicts, and also to allow communities to create their own murals. So this is a much different way than a lot of folks do this. And I have to tell you, you know how it is. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but even more than that. We know that art can speak to the heart as well as the head, and really reach a lot of folks. So we have this mural contest ongoing. The deadline is September 23. So it's not too late. So if you go onto our website, that's surviveandthriveadvocacy.org, you'll see information. And I hope you'll share this information with anybody you know who is an artist and might be interested. Okay, next slide, please.
Oh, your slides keep getting stuck.
They are stuck today. They're in Friday mode too. All right, everybody. Well, I'd like to introduce our speaker now, and let me start by saying, on a just personal experience note, I remember talking about this issue for the very first time to a small group at one of our local meetings. And as a lawyer and as somebody who is familiar with the legal system, not as much as our speaker, but definitely some familiarity, I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to mention this new law that has to do with, expungement of criminal records of trafficking survivors. Thinking it might have been one of the more drier or one of the more esoteric or one of the most sort of, I don't know, kind of below the radar things in the legal system that people would be interested in. But I will tell you that this issue struck a chord with so many people in that room. It moved me ever since then to make sure that we don't forget to talk about expungement and have it as something that you know about, because it's also, while it's a remedy for people who have already gone through a legal process, a criminal, in the criminal justice system, knowing about these cases and understanding that this remedy is needed should help us understand how we can avoid survivors ever being arrested in the first place, ever being charged, ever being looked at as anyone other than someone who's being victimized by a trafficker. So that's kind of a simple, maybe simplistic overview, but I'll tell you, that's why I'm so glad to see the people who are here are not just lawyers. So, by the way, lawyers and paralegals, 2 hours of CLE credit is coming to you for watching this, and I'll get that to you. But also because you as advocates, you as people in the community need to understand this law is there, both to talk to folks and also to understand what it's all about. So with that, that's my little commercial, Brent, because this is so important. I'm so grateful to you again for being here. So know that Brent is the executive director and lead attorney for the Justice Restoration Center. Upon learning that legal services would be an emerging and critical need in survivors' restorative journeys, Brent started the Justice Restoration Center, a nonprofit dedicated to providing pro bono, trauma-informed legal services and anti-trafficking advocacy on behalf of victims and survivors. Brent has initiated and successfully advocated for survivor-centered legislation, including Florida's human trafficking victim expungement law, eliminating the statute of limitations for trafficking crimes, and the non-criminalization of commercially sexually exploited children. He and his wife, Pamela, who leads the Advocates Against Human Trafficking, arrange safe prison releases for previously trafficked inmates by coordinating safe transportation and restorative housing. And I will tell you that last piece as well. And Brent, I know we go back and forth during the session sometimes, and you've reached out to STAC, and we've been able to assist with some of that work you do with people who are coming out of the prison system. Just want you all to know that that is something, all of it is important work, Brent, and really, I hope everybody on this call is similarly going to be available to you should you need help in communities across our state and even nation. You should know too that Brent is an expert in this area. We're very lucky in Florida that he is here. And Brent, let me invite you to share your screen, and we can start the presentation. And also, I just want to quickly tell everybody on the art project, the pieces have to be completed by the 23rd. So I'm answering that question there. Thank you. Okay, Brent,
Right.
over to you. And everybody feel free to put questions in the Q&A, chat your comments and ideas. I will share them, and we'll ask Brent during the process, especially if the question is on point with something he's just talked about. But we really do want this to be an informative conversation about this process and things that are related. Okay, now I promise, Brent, I'll say welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate it. And I think the screen sharing should have been a success. Does it look
It is perfect.
Wow, that's amazing.
You've done it. You've done it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me back to talk about expungement and a little bit about the elephant in the room. When we talk about expungement, we're really the issue of criminalization of victims is sort of that issue that is implicated when anytime we talk about criminal record relief for trafficking survivors. So as Robin said, I'm the lead attorney and executive director of the Justice Restoration Center, which we do provide no-cost legal services to victims and survivors of human trafficking. We do only work in the space of human trafficking. We don't. We've found that to be plenty for what we have the capacity to do, and it also, I think, it helps us to really be able to focus on a subject matter area and really do our best to serve survivors of trafficking. We have clients literally all over the world, and we represent them on Florida and Tennessee legal matters that resulted from their commercial exploitation for sex or labor. So we have a majority of sex trafficking clients, but we do have labor trafficking clients, and we are continuing to see and to understand, I think, the intersection of sex and labor trafficking. But we want to serve trafficking survivors from all manners of exploitation. So we're part of the National Survivor Law Collective, which is a small group. I wish it was larger, but it's a small group of legal services providers around the country who we just kind of gathered one year. We were at a Shared Hope conference, and some of us didn't know each other, and we kind of just got together and said maybe we should kind of link arms and see if we can help each other, do this work, encourage each other, resource each other, and that's been a great coalition. Again, we hope that it grows, because we need so many more legal services providers in this space. And I may touch on the gaps in legal services for survivors in a little bit. So a lot of people, sometimes when I first started doing this, it was not intuitive to many of the people in this conversation that human trafficking survivors had legal issues that resulted from their trafficking. And I think that's maybe because I was talking to the wrong people. I don't know. Maybe we just weren't thinking about it as much. And this would have been in 2008, 2009, kind of in those years. Immigration was kind of the obvious one when obviously we're dealing with international victims. But for domestic victims, it really wasn't, it wasn't totally on, I think, the mainstream radar as to what these issues might be. But over the years, we have learned and kind of look at these, we obviously state and federal criminal arrest records, which is sort of the substance of what we'll talk about today, but coerced debt and debt bondage, family law matters. If you're a service provider and you're working with survivors, you see this all the time, right? Custody issues, divorce, child support. There are so many things that come out of potentially come out of a trafficking situation that implicate family law. And it's a huge gap in terms of the available services. So a coordination of out-of-state counsel. We have many individuals come to us, or they're referred to us, who need an attorney in Kentucky or in another state. So we try to forge relationships with out-of-state attorneys who work in the human trafficking space, so that we can have those referrals. Warrants, we always have warrants coming up, outstanding warrants, whether they're in Florida or in another state. Other states sometimes they may have a criminal record relief law, but a survivor isn't eligible if they have an outstanding warrant in another state. So that becomes a big issue along those lines. Intellectual property rights, which sounds kind of like, well, so what kind of intellectual property rights would be implicated by a survivor's experience? But what's happening, and thankfully what's happening, is more and more survivors are advocating publicly. They're writing, they're creating content. In other words, things that are protectable under a copyright and trademark law. And so while those are not legal issues that may be directly resulted from their trafficking, they're important legal issues that continue to empower them and protect them in moving forward with their sharing of their stories or their development of curriculum, that sort of thing. So those intellectual property rights pieces are becoming more and more important. Immigration, like we talked about a little earlier with our international clients, and federal tax matters. And you all may have run across this, where a survivor was working in a situation where there was maybe a 1099 generated, for instance, working in a legal brothel in Nevada. And so at the end of the year, a 1099 is issued. Of course, for the survivor, all the money went to the trafficker, right? So over the period of years, the IRS comes back to the survivor and tries to collect a big tax debt. We have seen those matters, been able to resolve those successfully, but it's still a huge challenge, and I think it's a growing issue. So, as Robin mentioned, and thank you for those kind words, Robin. Safe prison release is one of the things that we are involved in. It's one of my favorite things that we do, working with. And it's another one of those things that I never even thought about until we were actually in the midst of the situation. And we had a client who was incarcerated and was going to be getting out. And it so happened that at the same time there was a trafficker out of Orlando who was recruiting women out of the Florida correction system. And kind of shopping, if you will, online for various, women and when they were getting out, and would write to them and sort of develop this relationship with them and pick them up at the prison, take them to Orange County and traffic them. So this was kind of happening at the same time. So my wife and I decided, let's see if we can't maybe give them an alternative. And not really having any idea what we were doing, we stepped into that and have had a number of releases where we work with with Her Song in Jacksonville, Created in Tampa, various safe house residential programs, and then we drive up and pick them up from the prison, and just to make sure they're safe. So that's been an incredible work, and we're still doing it and still learning. So safe housing, trauma therapy, employment, we don't do those things, but our clients, as you all as service providers, as it's just like you having a client as a service provider that may have legal needs. So our clients have all of these kinds of needs, and so we're able to collaborate with so many community partners and other folks around the country, really, to just to make sure that we do our best to for safe housing and for these other services that are so critical. We're not so big to think that this is like legal services like the main thing that they need. There are so many pieces to the recovery process. We're thrilled to have a little part in it, but we know that it's so important to make sure that they're connected to these other services that they need. Also, again, talking about legislation and policy, and some of that work's primarily been in Florida through the years, under the legislative leadership of Representative Ross Spano, but we've done some work in Tennessee, which is a whole other animal, if you will. Different legislature, different dynamics, different priorities. So it was a little bit eye-opening when I was admitted to practice in Tennessee and started to get involved in their system. It was a different experience. And we've worked with a number of other states just in consultation on expungement law, but on some other areas as well. So I do today want to talk about expungement of Florida criminal arrest records. I know we have some folks from out of state, and I apologize if it's not directly relevant, but it should be indirectly relevant, at least, because criminal record relief is important everywhere, and not every state has a great law to deal with this. Florida has, I think, a model law. I think it has one of the best in the country. And so as we talk through this, maybe if you are in another state, there'll be some similarities, or there'll be some things that might be helpful. Certainly feel free to reach out to us if we can be helpful in moving that forward in another state. So expungement, expunction, I mean, our statute calls it expunction. We call it expungement. It's just kind of an easier word to use. There are some actual technical differences, and I'm not even going to bother to get into those because they don't matter. But as we talk about this today, I'm going to use the term expungement primarily. And I guess that since we're talking about how we talk about this, I'll primarily refer to those that have been through trafficking as survivors. Sometimes we talk about victims as individuals who are still being trafficked, and I may use those words a little bit interchangeably. And I know survivor, not all want to be called survivors, but that's kind of how we're going to talk about it today. So what is the issue? Basically, individuals that have been trafficked are primarily coming out of the life with criminal records. 90% of sex trafficking victims come out of sex trafficking with a criminal record. They may have, this list is not exhaustive, but prostitution, drugs, theft crimes, battery on a law enforcement officer, false report to a law enforcement officer, human trafficking, right? We talk about, commonly referred to as bottoms, but I don't like that word, but those who are coerced to traffic others. And so you have racketeering. I mean, just a number of things that criminal records that are resulted from the trafficking. And in case there's a question as to how these things can happen in a commercial sex situation, prostitution is kind of the obvious one. There'll be stings. There'll be various situations where where somebody's involved in prostitution. Drugs may be used to control a victim, or the trafficker may require the victim to carry drugs or sell drugs, or be involved in other drug-related situations, which those are actually issues of labor trafficking when that happens. There may be theft crimes, so shoplifting from Walmart. We saw an uptick in this during COVID, especially early on in COVID, when the commercial sex activity slowed down for a short period of time, and so traffickers, their thing is money, right? So they have individuals, going to Walmart, shoplifting computer, and whatever, that sort of thing. So we see that, and again, we talked about battery and human trafficking, kind of how that happens. Practical consequences of a criminal record. This is something that we're all familiar with, I think, and I think this is what really got our attention back in 10, 12 years ago, was the not only the injustice of a criminal record that's not deserved, but the consequences of a criminal record in the recovery process. So someone comes out of life, and we want them to and they want to get back to a normal life, or discover a normal life, maybe for the first time. And so the list of things that kind of comprise that are involved in what we think of as a regular life: having a job, living somewhere safe, getting an education, having a family, those types of things. The criminal record is a huge impediment to that. And again, not something that we all know, that we're all familiar with that. We have clients who could not volunteer at their kids' school because of criminal record, and certainly their civic participation, even gun ownership. I mean, there's so many things that come with being a convicted felon. So you kind of have this cycle, right? The results of criminalizing human trafficking victims. You have an arrest, you have a getting out of the exploitation potentially as a result of that arrest, and maybe there's jail, or maybe there's prison. They come out, they can't get hired, can't get decent housing. They really, at the end of the day, don't have really meaningful choices. So they may be forced to get back into a situation of vulnerability. That may be dancing in a club, or some way of generating money, and just a portal back in, because the vulnerability is so high. It's just a portal back into being exploited. And so we've seen this cycle, kind of over and over. I think that it's so critical to understand that. And again, that's sort of the elephant in the room that I talked about earlier, and that is the criminalization of victims. And we do have to do a better job. And when I say we, you know, I'm talking about folks in the criminal justice system and law enforcement and that sort of thing. And I know it's a difficult issue, but we do have to do a better job of figuring out how to deal with this. So non-legal consequences of a criminal record, stigma, right? You know, you have the practical things, but then you have these things that are really trauma triggers. The arrest itself, and the trauma that's involved in an arrest. And I think, and this is not based on any research, but just our contact with, you know, over 300 survivors here doing this. Arrest for prostitution has a stigma and I think a trauma piece, you know, all of its own. And we feel like that's one of the types of arrests that are the most avoidable in terms of decision making on the part of our criminal justice system. But at any rate, in this idea of moral injury and shame that we see so, you know, that's so prevalent. I mean, we've had clients who didn't even want to talk to me about their record. I mean, it was just so difficult. And those things, those non-legal or non-practical, those things are all barriers, as you all know, barriers to recovery. Just really the impact of the criminal record on just life in a practical sense, and some of these intangible things as well. It's just super profound. So in 2013, in 2012, really, from a legislative standpoint, we began to have this discussion of, you know, this is, we have to have some way to deal with this. We have too many individuals with criminal records that they don't deserve, that came out of the trafficking, that impede their recovery. And what can we do about it? And with some great help from the folks in New York who had passed a similar law a number of years before, actually, they were very helpful in giving us material and research and information that helped us, again, under the legislative leadership of Representative Ross Spano in 2013. And that was his first year in the legislature. So he was a freshman member, and he introduced this legislation, and I was brand new to the legislative process. So in some sense, and I won't speak for Ross, but we didn't know what we were doing. But thankfully, there was seriously no pushback on this, and our legislature somehow just got it. And stakeholders who you might otherwise think maybe would be a little concerned with this type of thing, being able to expunge a criminal record just because you were trafficked. Well, won't everybody become a trafficking victim and try to game the system? We really didn't have that pushback, and we certainly haven't had that problem since then. So, you know, we hammered it out, passed it in 2013, unanimously, of course. It became law in 2014. We did the first 2 expungements in 2014, and it was remarkable. I think that the very first one we did was opened our eyes to some of these non-tangible issues, like the sense of shame and these sorts of things, because it really helped that sense of justice and that sense of vindication, I guess, that the court, you know, the state and the court acknowledged that, hey, this happened and this was wrong. You know, this shouldn't. Not only should you not have been trafficked, but you shouldn't have been held accountable for things that resulted from your trafficking. So it was great to get that done. We've amended it certainly almost every year since to fix things that we discover, well, we forgot to do this or we didn't realize this, and it continues to just be a great law for us.
Brent, somebody is asking, do you have any idea about the number of people who have had cases expunged to date in Florida or other states?
I don't have the number because I can tell you from our standpoint, we've expunged probably about 1,300 charges in 10 years, and that'd be reflective of probably over 200 survivors. And but we don't, because of the way expungement works, the record keeping is difficult because cases are expunged. So there sort of theoretically isn't that paper trail disappears. So we don't know how many more might have been done in Florida. I do know some other lawyers that are that do these, not with the kind of regularity that we do, but that do work on these. I know in the States, what happens is when you have, like, Georgia has a fairly new law, it's probably a couple of years old, it takes a while to ramp those up. So so I don't have any good numbers along those lines. My guess would be hundreds of victims. Again, every state's different, so some states have better laws than others. So
And
yeah.
I think I remember Kate Mogilescu in New York City talking about like 1,100 a month they did at the beginning, which was mind-blowing.
Yes, those were reflective of charges, as I understand it, and I don't know how many victims that would have
Right.
been, but that's a profound number, and obviously reflective of many lots of relief. But we'll see certain records. We may have a client with 50 charges in one county. So because of the revolving door, they're just continually arrested for the revolving door, especially has to do with, I think, prostitution charges, but drug charges, and it may span a 5-10 year period of time that they're being trafficked. And so they just mount up all these charges, and then multiple counties. So, not just in Miami-Dade, but Miami-Dade and Broward and, Orange County, wherever the trafficker takes them, is where they're going to pick up criminal charges. So.
Great. Thank you.
One thing to be aware of, whether you're an attorney or in the state attorney's office, or you're a service provider, or in the clerk's office, we have other kinds of expungement in Florida. And I'm not going to talk about those kinds because they're not seriously very useful for trafficking survivors. But we have other kinds of expungement, which we call it sort of the standard or traditional type. And those are very limited, as many of you probably know. You only get one for your whole life, and if you've got a conviction, you can't expunge anything, and that sort of thing. And what happened, especially early on when we passed our human trafficking victim expungement law, nobody knew about it. So we had service providers would call the clerk's office, or they call the state attorney's office for information, or Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And they would get the information for this standard or traditional expungement, which really had no application to the new law. So we've spent years trying to bring people up to speed that the human trafficking victim expungement law has none of the limitations that the standard expungement law has. And just a couple of examples of those: human trafficking victim expungement law vacates automatically, deemed to be statutorily vacated, as any conviction associated with the expunged record. So if we expunge 10 cases for a client and 5 of those resulted in a conviction, and maybe the other 5 the state just dismissed or null pros the charge, those convictions are vacated based on a substantive defect in the underlying criminal proceeding. So that's a meritorious vacature of the conviction. That is absolutely huge. That's how a convicted felon can become not a convicted felon under our expungement law. And there are other advantages, but another big advantage is you only have to disclose the previous arrest in 2 instances, which is if you're a defendant in a future criminal case, or you are applying for work with a criminal justice agency in Florida. Otherwise, you are not required. It is not perjury to deny that you've ever been arrested on an application or anything like that. So that's a big advantage over the standard expungement law, which has a number of exceptions where you have to disclose. And we thought that was really important because many of our clients want to get into nursing. They want to teach. They may want to go to law school and apply for the bar. We've had one of those. Really, this disclosure issue is really, really important. So the process, and I'm not going to get totally into the weeds because we could talk about this for a few hours, and some of y'all would get a good nap during that time, but we're not going to go down that road. But I do kind of want to give an idea of the process, because this for lawyers obviously very important to kind of grasp that there's a lot more to this type of an expungement than for the traditional expungement process. So I'm just going to kind of walk through these things. So what is the process here? So first of all, you have to determine whether somebody's eligible for the expungement. I mean, that's sort of the threshold issue, because if they're not, then we shouldn't be filing a petition to expunge. That is going to be, that's going to involve getting the information that we need to make that determination, which we generally, the way we handle it, we'll do an initial screening, which will be by phone or by Zoom, depending on what the prospective client is most comfortable with. It may be a very short meeting, maybe a series of short meetings. Again, from a trauma-informed perspective, we're trying to do this in a way that we're asking them to talk about the most horrible thing that's happened to them in their life. So we want to do that in a way that is the least re-traumatizing as possible. So we generally try to have initial talk in over the phone, and then we try to get more details in writing is the way we do that. So once we have that information, we've determined there's eligibility for expungement under the statute, then we have to determine where we're going to file. And that may sound pretty simple. Well, you file where there's a criminal record. But if they have a criminal record in 5 counties, there may be some strategy at filing in a particular county first, and then filing in subsequent counties after that. Or we may file in all of the counties at the same time. There's some strategy involved in where we are going to file a petition. If it's one county, then it's obviously going to be there. So, and then, we have pleadings and have to prepare documents. The client is going to have a sworn statement, and we're going to have gathered information for a sworn statement. Depending on the circumstances, we may have to gather very detailed information of their trafficking experience. We try to avoid that if we can, but where we can't, we need a thorough narrative of what happened to them. We file the petition and all the related documents, and then we wait for the state's response. And once the state has responded, assuming that the state does not object, we send a proposed order to the court, basically through whatever process they have, and ultimately get our expungement. So I want to talk just a little bit about eligibility for expungement. So the statute requires that and this is obvious, right, that the petitioner must have been a victim of human trafficking. And that's an analysis that sometimes is a little more complicated than it might sound, because we'll talk about a couple of things on a slide coming up, but it's not always the easiest thing in the world to determine whether or not a person has been a victim of human trafficking. That can be because the information may not be clear. The client may not self-identify, typically will not, and maybe really early in the recovery process where they're not interpreting what happened to them as human trafficking or even coercion. So that can be a process. Even determining what is a human trafficking victim under the law, that may sound like it's an easy analysis, and sometimes it is, sometimes it's clear, but sometimes there's a lot more pieces to it than than are obvious. So that is a process. Then, of course, determining what is an eligible offense, and we'll talk about what are not eligible offenses in a little bit. We have to establish a connection between the arrest that we're trying to expunge and human trafficking. So if someone is trafficked in 2010 and they have a DUI in 2016, we're probably gonna, now we may be able to say, well, because of addiction and those sorts of things, that what happened in 2016 was a result of trafficking. Yes, but that's going to be a stretch in terms of really fitting within the four corners of the law. So we have to make those determinations, and those determinations are not always that simple. It may be only a year apart. So what about that, year after the trafficking ended? Was there an associate maybe that kept contact and continue to make that the victim can do things that were involved in the trafficking situation? Lots of nuances there. That's why this isn't weekend pro bono work. This, with all due respect, this is serious work that takes serious analysis in all but the most straightforward cases. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Brent, and thank you. And I think that people don't understand, and I appreciate you raising this issue of how difficult it can be to determine what is trafficking. And that has implications really across the board for anybody who's working with survivors. Somebody, in fact, is asking, what if the client has limited recollection of when and what happened with the charges? That might be an opportunity for, I guess, for a lot of research, right? To look into various jurisdictions and see what you can find. But what do you think if the client is not sure of what happened?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It does sort of open the door to a couple of things. We have clients who were trafficked in the 70s and the 80s, and they don't, at that point, they're not really going to have a recollection, especially if it's an extensive record. They don't have any idea, what was happening. They have a general recollection, but not as it relates to a specific arrest and that sort of thing. In fact, I would say, Robin, that it's most common that survivors, no matter how recent their records are, have a fairly vague recollection for two main purposes. I think trauma and substance use, which again may be clouding that memory. So we will go and look at all the records we can to try to find some documentary connection with maybe there was an arrest for driving with a suspended license, and the trafficker was in the car, and is noted in the criminal arrest of the report. So, those are the types of things that we do to try to find that if we can. But the other piece of that is official documentation. And so our statute provides that if you have official documentation that tends to show that the petitioner was a human trafficking victim, then it creates a presumption, a legal presumption, that the offenses that you're trying to expunge resulted from human trafficking. And that's a fantastic presumption, because then if the state's going to object, they have to overcome that. In other words, state has to present some proof that they were not a human trafficking victim. And I'm unfamiliar with how that would happen. So we have ways to navigate, where there's a dim recollection or no recollection. Same thing happens with remembering traffickers' names. We have many clients who maybe only ever knew of a street name for their exploiter, or didn't even know that. If they were trafficked for a few weeks and maybe passed around to various traffickers, they might not have any of that information. And I think it's so important to know that's not a barrier. It's an obstacle a little bit, but it's not a barrier, and we have ways to work around that.
And so just a quick follow-up, somebody's asking about some examples of what that documentation could be, and I guess there could be other court records, but could you look at health records, school record? I mean, what are you thinking about?
Yeah. So the obvious and the great documentation is law enforcement report that identifies our client as a victim in a human trafficking investigation. That's that's fantastic when we have that. That obviously is rare. It's not rare, but it's not the most common. So then you start looking at what's other documentation. Is there an arrest report that names both individuals, or that that acknowledges some connection between the two individuals? There may be so there's another piece of this official documentation. There's a question as to what is official documentation from a local, state, or federal agency. And the statute does not say that that's a law enforcement agency, or that it's necessarily a governmental or a tribal agency. It just says agency. So we have interpreted that as broadly as we should, I think, as advocates, to include agencies like STAC and agencies like HerSong and other agencies, because these are agencies that are working with human trafficking victims. They got a level of expertise. And so we get documents. If our client's been through a program, we get a document basically identifying them as a human trafficking victim, talking about some about their recovery and the like. And we submit that as official documentation. Have we had pushback on that? Yes, we have. Some jurisdictions, they take the position that has to be governmental documentation. Leon County recently, we had a case there where a wonderful judge agreed with us and published an opinion, which was amazing. So
glad to hear that. That's great. That's great. And we have been asked often to confirm that someone has been there, and with their permission, we can do that. So that's good for everybody to keep in mind. But yeah, good to hear. Good to hear that. Yeah.
So it could be a sentencing memorandum. It could be anything out of a court proceeding. It may be a declaration in open court, an acknowledgement by the state that somebody was a human trafficking victim in a different case. It doesn't have to be related to the cases that we're expunging. And I think an important thing, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but an important thing is it does not have to be documentation that matches up with the timeline of the offenses that you're seeking to expunge. And that's really important. It might, but it doesn't have to be, because the statute does not require that. So we have to be careful with, if the state says, well, this is documentation, but it doesn't have anything to do with these charges. Well, that's not a statutory requirement. So you can't hold us to that, because there is no requirement for us to provide that. So these presumptions attach regardless. So
that's so, everything you're talking about here, I can tell you that even if we'd done this last year, but it's been 2 years, I can tell the breadth of experience in the cases that you've had are so all of this is so instructive, and some of the chat is reflecting people similarly, loving getting your information. So one of the things someone said here is that a published opinion in Leon County? Because I think it could be helpful in other jurisdictions. And if you get it, I can tell everybody, and I'll say it, I put it in the chat. This webinar, the PowerPoint, and anything else is going to be on our website. So the link is up in the chat, so you can look to that later. So is it an unpublished or published opinion, or can we still somehow get a copy of it?
It's an unpublished opinion because of obviously it's a trial court order.
Mm-hmm.
It would disclose all of our clients' information. So it's not.
Okay. All right. So that's too bad, but you know what? We all have made a connection here, and I'm looking at Victoria's chat that didn't go to everybody, but you're going to have Brent's information at the end. Somebody also said something, and this is an important thing to distinguish. Someone mentioned if a victim survivor is doing survival trafficking, and I think that's really more survival sex. If that person it's often referred to adults engaging in that, as well as minors. But someone is asking, what if a victim survivor is doing survival trafficking and was arrested, say working in a strip club, and was arrested? But I just wonder, is that person actually been trafficked? I mean, that's part of proving that up, right?
So I'm not exactly sure about the question. I will say this: if it's a minor, then absolutely. I mean, that's as a matter of law. If they're dancing in a strip club, they're trafficking victim. If they're involved in, we call it survival rape, but survival sex in exchange for anything, housing, food, drugs, that's human trafficking. Our view is that an adult who is involved in exchanging sex for, let's say, housing, drugs, well, anything, and there's an element of coercion involved, we designate that as human trafficking. And I think that's consistent with federal law. Mm-hmm. I think it's we've had clients who were not arrested in exchange for providing sex to the law enforcement officer. We would deem that to be human trafficking. There's an element of coercion there. And that's under color of law. I will not arrest you if you do this for me. Individuals that exchange sex for medical treatment, critical medical treatment, that's human trafficking as far as we're concerned. There's something in exchange of value, there's coercion, and there's commercial sex act. Same thing with lawyers who, here we are, I'm just saying, who exchange legal services, criminal defense services in exchange for sex. What's the individual what's the defendant gonna do? Okay, well, they're gonna provide that sex, or they're gonna go to jail. So those are instances where we don't have that traditional third-party trafficker that we would say is human trafficking. And I'll throw this in, not to really muddy up the waters, but you look closely at the definition of sex trafficking under federal law. You have sex trafficking, and then you have a severe form of sex trafficking, which requires coercion. But sex trafficking does not. It's simply really the commercial sex transaction. And in that same statute, it deems a victim of sex trafficking, or deems an individual who's subjected to that sex trafficking to be a victim of sex trafficking. So, you know, is our system up to speed on that, or do they agree? I'm not sure about that, but that's my position on those questions.
Great, thank you. Somebody else asked earlier too, when you were looking for documentation, that I guess this goes to the idea of bringing in an expert witness, like a trauma therapist, to testify on their behalf. Do you ever use expert witnesses like that in these cases?
Yeah, so we have almost never needed to do that, thankfully. And that's maybe something I've talked a little bit about pushback, and let me just say, almost across the board, our prosecutors in Florida have been incredibly collaborative and cooperative on these. I mean, 99.9% of the time. That's been one of the great joys of doing this, is working with our state partners, who get it. They get a petition expunge. They read the narrative and they're like, yeah, this is I have nothing to object to here. And so where we have had pushback, yes, we've used experts kind of in that role, to demonstrate, the trauma, to sort of, you hate to think you have to do this, but to make the story credible. And it can be very useful. Thankfully, we're not super experienced at it, and we haven't needed to be. Okay, so we just kind of talked about this. What is a victim of human trafficking? And I'll skip over that. Talk about grooming, and whether or not an individual who is in the grooming process but maybe never gets to the commercial, let's just talk about sex trafficking, never gets to the Commercial Sex Act. And under federal law, that grooming process, if the grooming is for the purpose of human trafficking, then they would be a trafficking victim at that point. So that ultimate commercial sexual activity, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that during the grooming process that individual was not a trafficking victim. Again, I'm talking about for purposes of expungement under our law. And this is one that I think gets missed a little bit, is the mentally incapacitated victim. So when under our human trafficking criminal law, if someone is, this is unfortunate language in our statute, but is mentally defective or mentally incapacitated, then they are, in essence, their status is that of a child, someone under 18 years of age, which means that coercion piece is not required. So if they're dancing in a strip club, or they're involved in I won't call it prostitution, but they're involved in commercial sex, but they are mentally incapacitated, then the analysis as to whether or not they were human trafficking victims should come under 787-06-3G rather than for the adult. I know there's other issues involved in that. You may have to document that, some things like that, but it's something to keep in mind. We talked about eligible offenses. What can be expunged? And in Florida, it's pretty expansive. We can expunge any offense except for this list here. And this is a statutory list. And these are the more violent offenses: arson, sexual battery, robbery, kidnapping. You can go down the list there. We would like to, there's a couple of things. We had a bill in the legislature last session, which made it all the way up to the week before the end of session. And it's inexplicable how this did not get passed. But we have proposed that when you have, at this point, if you have an arrest for any of these offenses, even if it didn't result in a conviction, you still can't expunge it. And our position is look, if you were arrested for robbery, and that's a common one, right? Where a trafficker sets up a would-be John who comes to the hotel, and then the would-be John gets robbed, and then our client gets arrested for robbery. But the state may drop it right away. But even in that instance, we can't expunge that robbery arrest. So our position is, if any of these offenses didn't result in a conviction, but resulted in an acquittal or a null state dismisses, then we should be able to expunge that. And we almost got across the finish line with that last session. We're hoping again, because sometimes we can expunge our client's entire record, but they've got this robbery, or there's a fairly big case that was an appellate case that had a kidnapping charge, but no conviction. And we need to make that so that those things can be expunged as well. We talked about the nexus or connection to human trafficking, and the language is that the offense or offenses must have been committed or reported to have been committed while the person was a victim of human trafficking, and as a part of the human trafficking scheme of which the person was a victim, or at the direction of an operator of the scheme. So that language trips us up a little bit sometimes, because there may be, what if they're being trafficked, but they go home to another state for Christmas. Trafficker lets them go. They go home, they commit a battery. Of course, that wouldn't be expungible under Florida's law anyway, but the point was that something that was remote from the trafficking scheme, and therefore not connected to it. But there's another standard in the statute, which I talked about a little bit earlier. When you have official documentation, it creates a presumption that the offenses you're seeking to expunge resulted from the trafficking. So being committed while being trafficked and as a part of the scheme is maybe slightly different than as a result of trafficking. So anyway, so the nexus to human trafficking, again, I guess this underscores the analysis as to eligibility it can be very involved, and you really, really have to think it through. We regularly talk to other lawyers about, what do you think of this? Try to collaborate and get ideas as to what, we want to make sure we always file these in good faith, but we also don't want to unnecessarily limit the remedy. So, and due diligence, basically, every petition filed these days would be with due diligence, because our law is still fairly new. It's difficult to find an attorney. The recovery process can be years long, so that's really not an issue. I'll just talk generally. There's no limitation on the number of arrests or convictions that can be expunged. You can file these in multiple circuits at the same time. The legal standards for determination with official documentation, it's preponderance of the evidence, which is obviously the lowest standard. Without official documentation, it's a higher proof standard, which kind of doesn't make any sense to me, because when you have no documentation, then it's even more difficult to get the expungement done. So we would like to actually eliminate that clear and convincing evidence, so that even without official documentation, if we can show that it's more likely than not, then we can get the expungement. There is no filing fee if you are going to file one of these and the clerk comes back and says, well, you have to pay the $42 or $50. No, statute, that's in the statute. There's no filing fee. Previously paid fines for expunged records must be refunded. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And as of July 1st, this year, petitions to expunge all subsequent and related documents filed in the case are statutorily exempt from public records. So that's basically that's been a little bit of a problem through the years. We've always been able to get them deemed confidential, but it was sometimes a battle. And so now the statute's clear that it is confidential. What does a survivor have to do? Really important for service providers to kind of know, because many of our clients are walking with service providers and therapists through this process. They do have to provide information, usually about what happened to her or him. When we have really strong official documentation that I talked about earlier, like an indictment of a trafficker that names our client, and then we don't have to get any more information from the client. And we want to get as little information as possible so they don't have to go back through their experience. But again, sometimes we do. A survivor sometimes can help gather documents. Sometimes that process is empowering for a survivor. Sometimes it's a burden if it is, if it's triggering, that kind of thing. We do it. But if they want to gather medical records that they need to be part of getting anyway. In some instances, and I think I don't know how we're doing on time, but I won't go too deeply into this, but they may need to interview with a prosecutor. And that's kind of a friendly way of a prosecutor, maybe in a case with no documentation or a case that's 30 years old. The prosecutor may just interview our client and just get a sense of whether or not they seem credible. And so those have generally been victim-centered interviews. We've only had a couple of bad experiences with those. And in every instance, the prosecutor has agreed to support the expungement. So
we're about 15 minutes out, Brent.
15 minutes. Okay. Well, we should be good then. The petitioner, survivor will not have to go to court. There's nothing in the statute that requires that. The statute says that the petitioner or the petitioner's attorney may appear. And I'll just add to that, if you're an attorney thinking about pro bono work, we have a provision in the statute that provides that the attorney may appear electronically. So that means Zoom, phone, whatever means is available. And that is a statutory, really the court is required to permit that. So that means, so that's the only way we've been able to file these literally all over the state. And generally we don't have court, so it's not really been an issue very often, but occasionally they want to have a hearing or something. So that's an important feature of the law. And certainly survivor concerns, which really we should be talking about all the time, right? Because this whole process should be survivor centered. How long will the process take? There's no great answer to that. That, as you can see, that upfront process and information gathering and analysis can take a good while. Once it's filed, depending on where we file, the state may take a long time to respond. So those are the two big variables. Once it's in the state's hands, some states have provisions in their expungement statutes or vacatur statutes that force the state to respond in a certain period of time. And if the state doesn't respond, then it's presumed that the state doesn't disagree or doesn't object. Our problem with that is sometimes these cases are complicated, and we know the state gets them. Typically, it's the human trafficking unit chief that may be reviewing the petition. And we know they have trials going on and that sort of thing. And so I'm reluctant to put a time limit, a statutory time limit, because I'm afraid if they get up close to that time limit, they'll just object. And so we'd rather collaborate, try to work toward a solution. It's worked really well for 10 years. And but it can add to that time. However, I will tell you that we had one case, we literally expunged a conviction overnight. And it was a special circumstance, involved a high level of confidentiality, sensitivity, an ongoing trafficking case. There were a lot of pieces in that. Collaboration with state attorney's office of statewide prosecution, the clerk's office, the Court, Department of Corrections, Florida Department of Law Enforcement. There were a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and we managed to file it one day, get the order the next day. So those kind of circumstances, gotta kind of know how to work that, but it can happen. That's not typical. So anyway, again, survivor concerns, is the information going to be public? Will anyone know that they filed the motion? So that it should be confidential. It's required to be confidential. The docket entry even should not say human trafficking expungement petition. It may say petition to expunge. So all should be confidential, but gotta be careful and gotta check. And after you file one of these, or even after we file one of these, if you're a service provider, jump on and check, make sure. And if you see it, then you gotta let us know. What happens if you win? What happens if you lose? Thankfully, our only loss in the state so far, we appealed and we won on appeal last year, or actually earlier this year. So that was a wonderful thing. Otherwise, typically they win. And we'll talk just a little bit about completing the process. So we get a final order to expunge. The clerk of the court seals the court records. They don't destroy the court records, but they seal them, and that seal can only be broken by a subsequent court order. They forward the expungement order to other agencies that they have reason to know has a record. So the sheriff's office, the arresting agency, Department of Corrections, if they were in prison, related to the expunged record, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, of course, who FDLE then forwards to the FBI for a removal from the national criminal information system. And that's kind of how that process works. I will say that Florida does a decent job of dealing with the post expungement kind of thing. I have colleagues in California, not to throw a state under the bus, but they say, they get the expunged record, but then it's forever to try to get it out of the government system. And Florida does a really good job. FDLE gets it. They understand what these are about, and most of our clerk's offices do as well. Post-expungement concerns, so government databases, got to be careful, again, with agencies that don't remove the records. Sometimes Department of Corrections doesn't get the information or doesn't process it, and so we just have to follow up with them. Sometimes there are warrants in other counties, and those warrants may be resulting from something that we expunged. So we'll go to that other county and say, look, the underlying case that caused the existence of this warrant has been expunged, and they generally happily remove those. So certainly you have commercial websites and stuff that lives on the internet, and it's terrible. And we have a wonderful service provider in Florida who has a professional background in background screening and the like, and they're super helpful. And I'm happy to connect you all with them offline, just to try to get rid of some of the Google stuff. And commercial background screening companies often don't update their records regularly, or maybe at all, and so they may have information that's old and needs to be updated. So again, I think we talked a little bit about what these things do. I want to talk about vacating the convictions. Again, that the vacating part, that means that this case has been substantively removed. Okay, it's been reversed, however you want to put it. The petitioner, the survivor, has been put back in the position they were in legally before they were arrested, which means that they are deemed to be innocent under U.S. Supreme Court law. And so That's a huge deal. It's really a big deal. And there are some legal results of that, which is that it eliminates any outstanding fine. So we had a client who had a RICO conviction. She got out of prison. We expunged, her trafficker was prosecuted in federal court. We expunged her RICO charge, which she owed $100,000 in fines, all wiped out, because there's no conviction, right? There's no legal support, there's no legal basis for that fine. Certainly restores civil rights as a matter of law if all the felonies are expunged. Can reinstate driver's license, they can own a gun, they can vote. One really important piece is they are entitled to a refund of any fines that they have paid in connection with the expunged record. So if they've paid $1,500 in fines, maybe they paid that money just so they could get their driver's license reinstated. They're entitled to a refund. And that is a U.S. Supreme Court law. I should have put the citation on here, but I didn't. But that's Nelson v. Colorado, a 2017 U.S. Supreme Court case that holds that it's a due process violation for the state to keep money that a defendant paid for a vacated conviction. We haven't had any controversy in terms of the entitlement. What's not clear is who has to pay that money. The state has to pay that money, but what entity of the state has to pay that? So we actually have a case in the appellate court right now that will maybe help determine whether or not the clerk's office has to pay that, and that kind of thing. So that's a work in progress, but it's important to know about it.
So informative. Got a couple quick questions. Should I ask you now, or
Yeah, go ahead.
5 minutes left? Okay. So one is, if someone is on probation, do they have to wait until the probation is over in order to seek expungement? And another quick one is, do you at the JRC represent minors?
Yes to the second question. We do not have a lot of cases involving minors, but we do them. The first question is, they do not have to finish probation. Legally, we can file a petition to expunge during the prosecution. There's nothing that prevents that, and we've had a little bit of pushback from time to time that will say, this is still an open case, or there's an open warrant, but there is no statutory requirement that a case be closed. This is unlike traditional expungement remedies, which require that a case have a disposition. There is no requirement. So we've expunged many cases with where probation was was still going on, and yeah, so that definitely.
Great, thank you.
And I'll just really quickly, we talked about some of the impact of criminal records. So some of the non-legal effects of expungement can be just emotional, can be reputational. It can definitely lessen the effects of trauma, or at least help to do that. The trauma, as a result of involvement in the criminal justice system. That sense of experiencing justice, that's just one of those things. I don't know what that feels like. We just have only been able to have our clients share with us what it felt like. Even if it didn't expunge their entire record, they still feel like, something right has been done. So I won't get into the myths and misinformation, but I do, Robin, I want to mention the Debt Bondage Repair Act. Can I talk about that for like 2 minutes?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and we're not going to have time, but I will tell you, somebody has raised the issue about it's sort of related to the affirmative defense issue as well. But what if the public defender determines that the charges are a result of trafficking? Can they get the charges dropped up front? Well, they could talk to the prosecutor, right?
Yeah, I mean, that does implicate potentially an affirmative defense. There's certainly issues of duress. That's a defense, common law defense. I think working with the state, if you can show that trafficking was happening. And if you know, we don't ever want to put this pressure on a defendant, on a survivor defendant, to talk about her trafficker and maybe help open an investigation. We don't want those kind of pressures.
Mhm.
But if they're willing, that can go a long way to mitigating either sentencing or getting rid of. And actually, the use of expungement, and we've done that in this type of case where we had a really good case, and so we filed the expungement during the prosecution of our client, and we're successful with it. So expungement can be used in a funny kind of way as a defense, like, well, you get this conviction or this result, we're just going to be able to come back and expunge it. So why don't we do this up front, instead of going all the way through. So
That's great. That's great. And let me tell everybody too, this PowerPoint is going to be on our website. I'll put that link again, because I know we're going to be going through these kind of quick.
yeah. The DBRA is the one thing I wanted to mention, because I want this to be on service providers and attorneys' radar. And that's the Debt Bondage Repair Act. If you're not familiar with it, that's a federal law that provides a survivor to the right to have adverse information on a credit report that resulted from their trafficking removed from their credit report. And that doesn't do anything substantively to the debt or to whatever adverse item it is, but it does enable them to remove those things from a credit report. And that can be huge, right? So you can even remove criminal record stuff, you can remove bankruptcy, you can remove evictions, those sorts of things. And it's not a difficult process. It's not like expungement that can take hundreds of hours. This is a fairly quick and easy thing that can be taken care of. So that DBRA, if you want more information about that, you can Google it, but you can also reach out to me, and glad to help, because we want to see lots of survivors taking advantage of this. Myths and misinformation, get the PowerPoint and look through these. These are the misinformation you may get from a clerk's office or even from other lawyers that do expungements, but they don't know about human trafficking expungement. So just some things like that. So I think that's it, Robin. It's 2:30.
I know we're right at the end, and we could talk about so much on this. It almost makes me want to do a part two. I always, get to this. We have such great speakers. I want to say there's so much more we can talk about. I just want to thank you. I want to emphasize too, we have had worked with survivors who have similarly been able to talk about their trafficking experiences, but when they started to talk about being arrested, they sobbed and couldn't move forward. It was actually the arrest was more traumatic in their relating their stories than what happened in their trafficking. And also, we've worked with a survivor who was, as a teen, trafficked and had charges related to that, and is in her 50s and had trouble getting a job. So people need to realize this is not like it happened last month or last year. This could be lifelong trauma that still was coming at her full force.
Absolutely.
And I don't see any other questions. Okay, somebody would come. Yeah, Mary Rose says, I'll come to a part two. Yes, okay, all right, Brenda. So Brent, you're being drafted, I have to say, into possibly a part two. Maybe we can look to January. That's our big prevention month. But this has so many ramifications. What you said about intellectual property and how now we're hearing so much about the importance of survivors owning their stories and not being exploited, for telling them, that hit me very, very powerfully. And as you said, 90% of sex trafficking victims have criminal records. That again, that statistic alone should send chills down many spines, as well as point to the need for this. So I have so many takeaways from what you just did and said and helped us with, Brent. I want to thank you again. And everybody, I thank you for attending.